Hey,
Hello, how's it going?
let me switch really quick. Hold on. Okay, all right. So, hi again, and
Hi.
hi everybody who's joining us today. Gosh, sorry, the angle's a little weird. So we have Calvin Laituri here, and I'm here with his work. Let's switch it around. Okay, perfect. We have his solo show here that just arrived a couple of days ago, and we'll be going through each piece today, talking about Calvin's work, and as usual, answering your questions. So please, guys, as they come up, just send them over in the chat, and we'll get through to them. So for everyone first seeing Calvin's work, these are actually ink on clapboard, but what's unique about Calvin's work is that it's also a bit of a carving. So he'll go into detail about that, but there's almost a push and pull effect that's quite visible, and hopefully with all these works here, you can see all those details, that medium of ink, as well as that pulling of the ink from the clayboard. Hopefully that's coming in clear. Hold on. So you guys can see. And so this is a collection of 10 works entitled August Rust. And so August Rust is inspired by a piece of literature. Do you mind telling us a bit more about that, Calvin, and why you chose it as your title?
Yeah, so August Rust is a reference to a Ray Bradbury book, which I quite love. It's titled Dandelion Wine. And whereas most of his books were kind of about science fiction, Dandelion Wine was about kind of a retrospective into his childhood and just kind of remembering things for the first time and that experience of like seeing the world through fresh eyes. And he described the kind of change of seasons from summer to fall kind of as the leaves kind of rusting, like a kind of rust spreading across the forest. And I just thought the image of that is quite wonderful, especially since I recently moved back to Vermont and got to experience a full Vermont autumn for the first time. And it's just something about the trees and the foliage up there is just really special. Just this cascade of colors just that descends from the tops of the mountains down into the valleys. It's just so poignant. And while I was creating all of these works, that was kind of in the background, just this gentle change of seasons from greens to yellows to these sunset reds, and it was just very inspiring. Especially lunar gristmill on the left side there was one of the first pieces that I really did in that new environment, and it was inspired by a lot of barns and agricultural architecture that was in that area, um, especially since in the New England area, a lot of the farmhouses are kind of traded through generations and owned by many families and built on many, many times. So what starts out as just a single building gets additions and roof lines built on and dormers built on. And um, the building kind of tells a story as it's changed hands and passes down as kind of a traditional thing in a way. And I sneak in some location specific kind of like vernacular architecture into some of these. There's one thing in Vermont in particular called the witch window. When a addition is built onto a house, there's kind of this diagonal window put in between the two additions, and um, it can be spotted in some of the barns there. And it's just a weird thing that's only in Vermont. And rather than get a custom made window for that weird diagonal space, they just used any old window they had and just kind of stuffed it in there diagonally, and it's just kind of a fun thing. So lots of references to these important pieces of literature and just kind of the surroundings I was new to and seeing for the first time.
I didn't know that about the window. Is it depicted in this particular piece or in the others?
It's in that one right there. So do you see the diagonal adjoinement between
Over here?
slightly higher?
Higher.
Right, yeah, see right
Perfect.
there.
Oh, right there.
Yeah, it's kind of
So
tucked
that
in
would be
there.
the window.
And in the Bailey Hazen piece, which is the
Like
snow-covered
below, right?
uh,
Nope.
the other snow cover.
That one,
Yes,
right?
that
Yep,
one.
I confused those two.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, and you can see the diagonal window in there.
So you guys, this one, right?
Yep.
Yep, there we go. This gives you guys good details also of the work. It's so hard to convey it through just JPEG alone, but what's quite cool and what we spoke about before also in our last video together are the lines, the placement lines, like such as the blue indicators here, as well as the reds that are over here that help you place your architecture and figure out your composition.
Yeah, so a lot of the process is still present in the works, just because it's an active piece. The sketches underlying the piece kind of influence the stuff on top, and it's important to show where things began and that transition from a blank canvas to something this detailed. It's important to kind of see what the process of that was and where you start. It's often a reminder to me, like, when I'm staring at these pictures for hours and hours, it's sometimes hard to see like how much progress I've made because I'm staring at one small inch, and it just feels like a whole day can pass and I haven't
You
achieved anything.
you
Um,
focus on these tiny little spots, but just
yeah.
line after line, and you, I imagine, lose yourself completely. And so it's almost kind of like a thread to bring you someplace
Hmm.
else, and as you mentioned, show what's been achieved thus far.
Yeah, and that's it's funny that you mentioned a thread because this piece is called Thread Between, and that is kind
Yep.
of a reference to that
Yep.
um, that tying piece between something beginning and ending for the first time.
Absolutely. And I always really appreciate seeing the progress and the process itself of the work. But I think when you have such perfect and such beautiful line work, that often makes you question how human the person behind the work is, because you have to have a lot of patience, such a steady hand, and just such a brilliant mind to conceive of these cities and these details. It shows that yes, a human was involved, because you can kind of see, oops, let's hopefully that focuses, they're not as tedious. There's a bit more, I think, human to
Hmm.
the red and to the blue, where they're not, I don't know what the right word is. Everything else seems so perfect.
Hmm.
And when you have these touches of blues and these lines that help you figure it out, the red here as well, and even some of the hints of what I'm guessing right here is kind of that engraving
Hmm.
effect over here. It gives it almost like a sense of movement. It conflicts against the perfect tedium of these lines that are so immaculate, and it makes them pulsate a bit more, and it echoes you behind the work. And I think it's such a wonderful touch. And for anybody who would appreciate your work, they'd love to see that behind all those buildings and all those details. So I'm a big
Yeah,
fan.
I think it's sometimes the slight, tiny imperfections in these works that show them to be human, because
Mm-hmm.
we're so often surrounded by digitally created pieces where lines are perfectly straight and everything's perfectly spaced apart and color choices are perfect, and you know we're just surrounded by this constant perfection that computers allow us, and we need to be reminded every now and then that there are things that are still created by hand, especially like you know I'm working my best to evenly space these lines one by hand, but there's a limitation to what we're able to do with our hands, and those
Absolutely.
small details kind of remind us that we are human, and we can try to get as close to being perfect as we want, but there's still that aspect of ourselves that's going to hold us back, and we should kind of be humbled by that. Um,
Absolutely.
I think when Persian rugs were still being made by hand, they would occasionally just in one detail just pull one thread incorrectly, just because they were adamant about the belief that only God could be perfect. Um,
Yeah.
so there's just sometimes intentional um, mistakes put in just to remind us that we are human, and that's where our place is in the world.
Absolutely. But in this case, again, it's process too, which I think is awesome. So I hope that you continue to give us hints of the time and as it unravels in each of these pieces. So
Mm-hmm.
going back to the exhibition title, August Rust, it's also the title of this particular piece, which was one of the first pieces for the exhibition. Why
Mm-hmm.
did you choose that title for this piece?
So that was another one of the early pieces I worked on when I first moved back to Vermont into this studio space, which I've recently just moved away from. So there's just kind of this reflection point, because um, a lot of my heritage is also from Germany. My mother's side of the family is from Stuttgart, Germany, and I spent a decent bit of time there, as well as I grew up in the Massachusetts area. So I was kind of reflecting on these two spaces as I was moving away, just because I had up until then recently been living in Savannah, Georgia, and then moved up the coast again to New England, and was just kind of like reflecting on all these different places in time I had been, and kind of wanted to create a collective work that was putting all that together, because all that was surrounding me was fall, and there's just all this change happening. So the two deer in the background are based off some statues that are in a park in Stuttgart, Germany, which is where my mother's from, as well as some of the architectural details. And some of the architectural details in the foreground, of course, are reference to H.H. Richardson, which was a famous Boston architect. So some of these heavy archway details are reference to a lodge design in Easton, Massachusetts, just this heavy stone lodge. And yeah, so that feeling of transition and change, that watching the colors change in the leaves was really important behind that work, and the subsequent work next to that, Lunar
Funny
Gristmill.
they actually got put together, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you notice in almost every piece there are two characters, animals, spirits together, and it's just kind of those constants on your journey, whether they are friends that stay by your side the whole time, or just certain books you read or music you listen to. There's always something there constant between these places, no matter where you go, and that's kind of like what I see as the definition of like home being, is those things you can bring with you from place to place, that tie it all together.
Do you find that the presence of two animals as a prominent aspect of your work could also represent the idea that there are always dualities at play? There's always two sides to every work and to every person and to pretty much everything in the world?
Certainly, yeah. Yeah,
As
that's true with pretty much everything. There's with every good situation, there's something that might be pulling it back, and with every bad situation, there's another side to it too. Especially right now, this pandemic is a good one, because there's so much stress and anxiety that, especially in the art world right now, just because it's already such a fragile place to be in, and then throw something stressful on top of this, it's really hard to create something. But I've tried to find some peace and try to focus on my work and what it means, and what I want to be putting out into the world. And you can see that in the newest piece, One Day, This Will All Be Memory. I was kind of reflecting on some of the history and lost histories in and around Massachusetts. So in the background is a post office that was once the center point of Boston. So the big building in the center.
This one, oh, this one, okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, this one in the background. Okay.
Yeah. And that was at one point one of the most important buildings in the city, and it was based off of like the Second Empire style, which was based off French architecture. And as time passed, and then when it was created in the 1880s, it was popular and in the style then, and by the 1930s it looked out of dated and out of place, so they tore it down and put up something else in its place. And there's this constant process of things being put up in things seeming outdated at the time, and then being torn down and forgotten about. So kind of celebrating these memories that are lost a lot of the time.
Absolutely, and your work touches upon that, but it also, I think, harks on the idea of architecture evolving to contemporary needs for today. So like the barn, for instance, as we discussed, the idea that these barns are just getting bigger and expanding and evolving to accommodate the growing families and the future generations. And then with some of the architecture and other pieces, it's a mixture of architecture that you're familiar with, as well as some architecture that you've developed yourself. So again, kind of echoing architecture of the past, where different styles may form out of fashion, but like I think we spoke about last time, Penn Station. I don't know if we spoke about it through video or through private talk, through DM, but nonetheless, no longer thinking that aesthetic is suiting contemporary day, and so just kind of changing that completely. But sometimes there might be remnants. And so I've always appreciated older architecture, and I think that the design and the aesthetics are incredible. So your work brings me back to that very often, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, it's sometimes the things that we, in a moment, decide we don't need, and then look back on and realize were really important to us, but didn't appreciate the value while we were surrounded by it. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, I
and
think a
that
trend.
was yeah, and that was kind of the vision in the time of urban renewal, where they wanted to take the old cities like Chicago and Boston and New York and um, shed the old because it was seen as out of fashion and heavy and um, just cumbersome. And they wanted to strip everything down and make it light and full of windows and essentially have no ornament. Um, but it's a strange thing because throughout the thousands of years we've existed as people, we've put ornament of some variety on our buildings. It's a sign of the things. It's a sign of the things a culture values. Um, so the acanthus leaves and the different details put in Roman columns and Gothic windows, the details and symbols there were important to the people and reminded people who they were and unified them. But only with our more modern architecture have we kind of stripped those details that remove the human factor and remove the identifier and the kind of cultural significance to the things that we spend so much time in. And we've really lost that. So even in something simple like a barn or a colonial house up in the mountains, like there are small details that kind of have a local flavor to it, just in the style and approach and the wood and the materials that made it part of that area and uniquely that area. You couldn't go anywhere else and find the same combination of things, but now you go to almost any city and you can see kind of Bauhaus style, international style, Swiss style things, and it makes you kind of forget what that local flavor is when it's consistent across every place you go to.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting, but it also is a bit sad because now certain elements of that location, as you mentioned, are a bit lost.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Um,
another one of those is like lighthouses,
yep.
because New England is, has a very long-standing seafaring tradition with, you know, it being a colony originally. So everything that it relied on pretty much came from England and other colonies. So there was just so much going up and down the coast. It was the highway at the time. That's the way anything moved. People, products, the roads were just non-existent. So lighthouses, I mean, were up and down the coast at every important terminal and city just so ships could navigate the way and be warned of the dangers there. And they too, like the lighthouses in northern Maine compared to the ones in Rhode Island, have a totally different style and approach to them. And it's yeah, it's another thing
Absolutely.
that's fading every passing day.
It seems so. I mean, obviously there are still novel architects, engineers, and designers that are instilling great design in their works, but there's something about the past and about the time, and I think the lower price materials perhaps that I think allowed people to invest more into the style and into the development of so many of these incredible buildings. I mean, when we look at older architecture, it would be inconceivable today to make a building like that because of the
Hmm.
sheer cost and whatnot. But we have them, fortunately, when we visit Europe. As you mentioned, a lot of inspiration comes from Germany and some of that revival here in the US too. And
Hmm.
so I'd like to know more about your fascination between such grandiose architecture, but also architecture that you see where you are in New England that's a bit more simple, perhaps more boxy instead of the curvatures that you might have in other pieces with the towers and the
Hmm.
archways. They're quite opposite. It's kind of like the complex and grandiose versus the simple and still beautiful, but just a bit more minimal in its aesthetic. And it plays on that idea of dualities being a big aspect of your work.
Hmm.
And I know, of course, that you've grown up and you've continued to live in New England while visiting Europe. But is there something more? Why do you find that you're fascinated with both different styles of architecture and you continue to put them into your work?
I'm glad you picked up on that because there is that back and forth going on because you know in New England, a lot of the buildings were being made at the same time. So in the early 1600s and 1700s, while cities like Hamburg, Germany, and Stuttgart were flourishing and economic centers of Europe, um, the colonies were just starting, and they were just using what they had at hand. Um, so the representations of the architecture are just like what was possible to the full extent of the skill and talent at that area, with the
Mm.
materials they had. So, as a city grows up and has more talent, they're able to make these grandiose, huge buildings with ornament and decoration. But in places that are still evolving and growing, um, they kind of have a more approach of utility versus ornament um,
Mm.
in a way. And so I see the ornament in things as being just like the height of what we're able to do. Our us working at 100% with our hands and our tools. Um, but the same thing was happening with a small community of 10 people raising a barn. Like they were doing the best that they could at that time. So while aesthetically the results are very different, it's just people working at their hardest and um, doing what they could.
Absolutely. It makes a lot of sense, and I truly understand that. And so I keep giving you guys looks. If anybody wants me to stop on anything as I move around on the pieces, or if you want greater detail, let me know. But I do want to talk about this piece because she does stand out. She's a lot more narrative based. There's a lot of
Hmm.
symbology, and her inspiration does come from a film.
Hmm.
Your work brings in a lot of narrative attributes in general, but this one I think has a lot more as far as having this kind of like flame feel,
Hmm.
having an animal versus some female figures, which the human figure is not something that I notice too much in your work. You do actually, another thing I want to talk about after this is your use of older vehicles of transportation,
Hmm.
not having something so specific to today to place your work in 2020.
Hmm.
But before we get to that, of course, giving a bit more insight into the symbology of this piece, the film that inspired it, and so on.
Yeah, so the inspiration behind this piece was Midsummer, which is a A24 film from I think last year or 2018. Can't quite remember. Um, which I love A24's work. They just do some really special films in a time where films are really just made as a way to make money. They really do focus on the art and aesthetic of the films they put out. And the aesthetic of Midsummer was really fascinating to me. Just um, not only in being in a horror film set in a very unique place, but just these elements of traditional folklore and again, like marking the specific point in a season. They were marking the height of summer, the the day of longest days, and they were just kind of putting together a ritual to celebrate good harvest and um, good tidings in the coming year. So I think that ties like when I watched that film, I just realized how much it tied together with the series and um, that kind of passing of time being an important indicator. Um, I don't know. So just this kind of marking of a change and in season and the different colors present at the time and the different foliage and fauna present at the time. Um, and I don't want to spoil anything about the film for anyone who hasn't watched it, but there's just some really breathtaking, like climactic moments, just with really strong imagery and bold colors. And I don't know, it was just really fascinating. And I just thought it tied together with all this. And especially the themes of the harvest and the wheat and the animals um, and then putting all the flowers together to create these wonderful arrangements with all this dark undertone I thought was just really fascinating.
I think so. I think it really exemplifies your technique and the versatility of the line itself. I mean, you have so many different directions and so much saturation of black versus an incredible amounts of white and then all the areas in between and how just from just a simple movement and shape and length of line, you're able to develop so much. I mean, with the fur. And then, of course, you have the hands, which are really interesting too, because here you guys can see the shadows, especially, are quite beautiful. The cloak that's over the hands or the garment, the piece of wood. And there's just so much in here that I haven't seen the movie yet. I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to. I
Mm-hmm.
was supposed to see it a long time ago, so I don't understand the symbology personally, but for
Mm-hmm.
me, the narrative is always what struck me because there's just so much to take in. And there's so many stories that I think can unravel with or without knowing the movie itself.
Mm-hmm.
So I will get back to you on that when I do watch the film.
Okay, good.
But
I'll try my best to not reveal anything too much
yeah,
about
no,
it.
you did well. But you mentioned time, and I think that that's such an important theme of your work because the works are all timeless. They have elements of different periods, and as I had mentioned a bit earlier, the idea that you're kind of using what's probably an antiquated cart now or vehicle, and I don't know if that's from the film, but it's interesting for me because right now I haven't seen the film and I wanted to
Hmm.
wait because I'm, I guess, pursuing a more outside perspective, just looking at the work without any inclination or idea as far as its inspiration. And you, of course, as well as maybe some people watching who have seen the film, have a different interpretation because they're, of course, going to recognize these elements. But, going through the others too, again, you have an antiquated vehicle, which some people still drive, obviously, but it's just not
Hmm.
as functional today as what we have. But bridging different times, different places, tell us why you like to merge those worlds, whether it's the physical or of time or of something else.
Yeah, so I like really exploring this place without time, this place without location. Um, it's just kind of an amalgamation of things, and whether you not or you believe in parallel or alternate realities, I just envision this as a time after us, and just kind of a time between memories and streams of consciousness, and just kind of how we sometimes remember things imperfectly, and sometimes details we thought we remembered aren't really there, and
Yeah.
how that kind of fades over time, and how it's this really impermanent thing, which is kind of the duality. It's put on ink on this very rigid surface, so it's kind of almost preserved for a very long time. But um, this really fleeting thing that is memory. Um, but what really fascinates me about what really influenced me was like the kind of romantic period of art. So they painted a lot of mountains. They painted a lot of scenes that focused on the grandiose aspects of nature. So putting people in contrast with the vast landscapes of a mountain, or these sweeping vistas of clouds and the thousands of feet, and how large those things are. And um, I think that was kind of a period where it was coming into question. Religion was such a binding element for so long, but it was coming into question, like whether you know God was the only thing that was, I don't know, um, so almighty and all powerful. But um, so they were just trying to come to terms with like nature and the vastness thereof, and how insignificant and small people were, and that passage of time, looking at that, just how, when you're in a place like New England, looking at the passage of time, you can see buildings from the 1600s and 1700s and 1800s, and which you just try to like step back and just try to visualize all of the things that have happened in these places across all that vast space of time. Some of these images are just kind of condensations and collections of not only what has happened, but what maybe will happen, and it's kind of an exercise in thinking about that. Um, because in the grand scheme of things, there are so much of our daily lives is just focused on us and the things in front of us, but we find it so hard to step back and really appreciate the vastness of everything surrounding us, and the time that has passed in the places we stand, and the things that will happen there, and just the immensity and beauty of nature surrounding all of us, and how the natural world can really just overarch and overshadow the even the grandest things we make.
Absolutely. I mean, humans by nature have to be self-centered because that's how they survive. If they weren't
Mm-hmm.
concerned about themselves and their children and loved ones, they wouldn't make it. But at the same time, we have the ability to go far beyond that and build incredible works of art and buildings and bring out ideas and just advance and evolve so considerably. But as you've suggested and as your work also alludes to, nature can reclaim that within probably a couple decades. And
Mm-hmm.
so very little evidence, and eventually probably not much evidence at all will remain. And it is a constant reminder of how small, but again, how powerful, but that the element of dualities again, and how you can kind of have a touch of both. And so going back to the Midsummer piece really quick, it's titled It Corrupts the Soul, but how did you feel about having to put human figures? Let's go back so everyone can see them again. Because in this entire series, as I mentioned, these are the only human figures that I've noticed.
Mhm.
And there might be like a suggestion, like a statue, perhaps. I don't know. I don't think I recall seeing any kind of statues or sculptures that represent or that are anthropomorphic. But in the Midsummer piece, it's obviously because it's such a more narrative style piece, you
Mhm.
have those figures. But have you ever considered putting figures in other works?
So I consider the Midsummer piece to kind of be a unique part of this series, just because it focuses on this the references to this piece of media and um, kind of pulls details from the stories within that. Whereas the rest of the pieces are kind of my own stories and my own narratives. Um, so that one is just kind of more of a direct reference to the elements in that. Whereas these surrounding pieces, I kind of want to explore the stories of the things that surround us. Um, so animals and nature and the architecture and um, well,
Yeah.
these. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say it all makes sense.
Mhm.
And so another piece that I actually want to touch upon, which I think is a bit unique to this group, is Stranger in the Field. And I'm going to zoom in
Mhm.
um, over here. This is more obviously rustic. It doesn't have architecture. It's more of a kind of remnant of humans through their books and their writings.
Mhm.
And then, of course, how they play off with the landscape with what's a really beautiful reflection of the trees down here. Tell us more about the title inspiration as well as the story you're telling with this particular one.
So, Stranger in the Field, I think, is actually um, maybe one of the earlier pieces in the series that had kind of come before I had um, really condensed an idea of what was going to be the binding element of all these. And it was a reference to Watership Down, which I happened to be reading with a couple of my friends at the time. And it's a story that follows this troop of rabbits um, as they realize their home is being taken over by people for a housing development, and they're trying to find somewhere new. And it's just this story as animals kind of in their fear of man, um, which is an interesting contrast kind of to the rest of the story because while there's parts of nature that with time can supersede buildings and stone and the architecture we put together, but we often feel like we have power just because we can directly manipulate small things. So, you know, um, people can chase away animals or break branches on trees. And in the moment, it feels like that gives people power, but in the long term, time kind of shows that nature will take all that back. But more directly in the story, it just kind of ties these elements. You can see that there's like an axe in that tree right there, as a reference to that kind of that tree being cut down, and the books kind of scattered next to it, just kind of as these remnants of someone having been there. Um, and then these animals just kind of taking that space, and you know, some of these books are starting to become returned a part of nature, and they're surrounded by these live trees. So there's kind of like this small circle of life right in there. There's this patch of trees, one being cut down, and then kind of these books fading back into nothing. Um, and of course, there's like this rabbit down at the bottom, and there's a wolf or canine predator at the top. So there's just kind of all these cyclical elements within all of this. And you notice the book that's split open in front of the wolf, and um, it's just kind of is also in reference to a an art installation I saw in the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, in which it was a giant bird cage filled with books all about birds. So every aspect of um, mating cycles of birds or taxonomy, just this cage was filled with books about birds, and there were actually zebra finches and small canaries flying around it. And the irony was that these birds were surrounded by all the information they could ever want to know and possess about themselves. But here they were flying around and going about their business and ignoring all of it. um, just because they were living their life as they wanted it. And um, I don't know, it's just sometimes like sometimes the answers are right in front of us and we're just ignorant of it, I guess.
I think it's a really great
Hmm.
sentiment and something that we should be reminded of. And perhaps sometimes we don't need to know all the answers and we could live perfectly happy lives without them.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah. I think it's
exactly.
quite creative, though, that in a sense you brought the books in because Watership Down's a story. It's a book, I believe, right? But it's also
Hmm.
a movie. And so these are stories that get passed down, but without the continuation of humans, they represent absolutely nothing because, these creatures can't read. They have
Hmm.
no idea what these books are. And it's only going to be a matter of years before the water over here in this lake or before the overgrowth starts to grow over them.
Hmm.
So yeah, hopefully you guys can see. I'm trying to really focus on the technique too, so you could understand the difference in medium and the push and pull effect. I'm gonna go over here actually because I think this is probably a good example where you can see, hold on, the way that, am I highlighting a good spot for the carving effect that you
Yeah,
achieve?
I think maybe slightly to the right of that, where you
Right
can
of
see
that.
these like kind of like in the background with these like sets of white lines kind of the buildings in the background, like kind of towards the top right.
Oh,
Yeah, so these you can kind of see like where there was black first, and then there was the white pulled out of it, which is reminiscent of wood engravings and wood carvings of the mid to late 18th century. Was a process in which they started with pretty much an entirely um, flat piece of end grain wood and would reductively carve images out of that, which were then used in book printing, which is an entirely time consuming and highly skilled affair just because there is so much you have to do with kind of reducing. And once you've um, reduced or carved away a part of your work, you can never get that back to any degree. And so it's incredibly unforgiving and challenging and just a very demanding medium. And while I would love to do that, it's just at the moment right now out of my reach. So Clayboard is a really good approximation of that because you can work a dish additively and productively. So you can work with ink and then kind of work with these aspects of carving. So you can create images that are feel very familiar and reference a lot of these techniques and styles, but um, gives you an ability to move a lot faster and um, there is a bit more forgiveness in the medium overall.
but you've mentioned in the past too that there's only so much carving that can be achieved
Hmm.
before the clayboard itself is no longer there, and then you're stuck with what's left.
Yeah, so the surface is very thin. It is just a, I'm not sure exactly what the exact thickness is, but it's a very thin layer of clay. And then
Let's see if I
which it's
can.
backed by is this kind of hardboard kind of masonite thing, which is a rigid support to the surface because if it were to bend too far, it would break because it's very brittle. Um, so it's not nearly as demanding as wood engraving would be, but it's not an entirely forgiving media like a digital workspace where you can just erase and add as much as you'd want. Um, so it's kind of an interesting modern hybrid of kind of these old styles.
And so obviously these older styles inspire you greatly. And I know in our last video we spoke about how you went to museums and you were exposed to art at a young age. Do you mind just talking a little bit more about that again for those who missed it?
Oh, certainly, yeah. That's something I'm very, having grown up in the Boston area, oh, my dad just sent me, it's a 1.01 inch thick.
Which you
He's
guys
watching this. Hi, Dad.
again can see, hi, which is a plus as far as why these aren't framed yet, because framers are closed, of course. But
Yeah,
it allows you guys to truly understand then that clapboard medium and how it's affixed to that panel behind it, and
yeah.
how
So,
little wiggle room Calvin has when he's carving.
yeah, 0.01 inch is not a whole lot in the grand scheme of things.
No, not at all.
But museums, that's one thing I'm really thankful about growing up in the Boston area is we had the Museum of Fine Arts to our access, and I mean, I've gone to a couple museums all across the world, and I don't know, the Museum of Fine Arts is like one of my favorites, just because there is such a breadth in their collection, and there's just these. constantly rotating collections of artists, and some of the pieces they have in their permanent collection are just beautiful. So they have one of my favorite pieces of the kind of romantic sublime era is JMW Turner, which I got to see an exhibition of his works and studies in Nashville at the beginning of the year before everything shut down. And they have one of his most famous original pieces that is the slave ship in their permanent collection. And it's just such a beautiful piece because it just shows the vastness of the ocean and the boundless colors and immensity of the sky, and then it's just these small people kind of stuck within the tides, lost at sea. And it just really gives that sense of scale. Um, but I think one of the pieces that influenced me the most at a young age was seeing Andrew Wyeth's Christina's World, which was a piece. Um, Andrew Wyeth is like now one of my favorite artists because he was an active painter in Maine, and he would often live on location for his paintings. He would spend sometimes months just living with a specific family, just kind of studying them and the place they lived, and then creating these artworks that were just genuinely inspired by the experiences and surroundings he was surrounded by. And I just think he was one of the best researchers when it came to art. He would just surround himself by it for months just to work on a single piece. And I don't know, I'm constantly inspired by him and not only what he created by his process that followed, the process that was underlying all those pieces. So Christina's World, I think I encountered in New York City. Might be at I'm forgetting the names of the New
Maybe
York
the MoMA.
museums. Yeah, I think it's at the MoMA.
Yeah.
But it's this piece where it was the daughter of the farmhand. She had some sort of condition in which her legs wouldn't really work. So she had to kind of drag herself around with her arms. And the piece is her at the bottom left corner of this field, and the house is far off in the distance in the top right. And she's, sitting at the bottom of this field and just kind of, you can just really feel the immensity of distance that she had to travel just to get back to the house. Where with someone with, properly working legs, they could just get up and walk over there and it wouldn't be a huge problem. But to someone like her, he really was able to kind of capture the struggle and hardships that she faced in her life just through this painting. And it was just kind of like this really interesting moment that allowed me as a young person to kind of look through someone else's through someone else's experiences and see what the power of art was. And I'm immensely thankful for being able to see that stuff at a young age. And I thank my dad and mom and everyone for influencing, showing me that stuff.
Absolutely. And your dad is a creative, as is your mom, although in different ways. And
Hmm.
just if we can go into that a little more too again for anyone new who will be watching.
Yeah, so my dad is a creator, as well as my mom. They do very different things, and I do different things than them. So my dad is a industrial designer and product designer, and works a lot with designing products that are um, right now sourced locally. So we have the same love for kind of New England and the history here, and there's such a history of manufacturing here. The Industrial Revolution pretty much happened in northern Massachusetts, in Lowell, Massachusetts. But as the country's grown and spread further west, a lot of that stuff is, the buildings and hints of that industry is still there, but a lot of it's moved further west and sometimes overseas. So a lot of what his work focuses around is trying to um, bring back that manufacturing, the things that people used to create in these spaces, and design products around that, um, which is really important. And we kind of realized, especially in this pandemic, how important it is to have things made locally and have access to that. And we realize how
Absolutely.
fragile our supply chain is when it's, an ocean away.
Yeah.
Um, and my mother growing up was just a wonderful chef. She would, not only just create these wonderful dishes that were inspired by German culture and American culture, um, but she would bake as well and create these beautiful cakes. And I don't know, she was able to use these skills to create all these different experiences with food. And there's just so many foods I can just remember growing up, that if I were to eat them now would just take me, exactly back to that point in time. And it just it just influenced me a lot, like how, you know, you don't necessarily have to create a painting or a sculpture or an image to relive a certain experience. Food and um, the experiences we have with people together can do that as well. And I'm very thankful for my parents for teaching me that.
Absolutely. I'm thankful to them too. And growing up with someone having that creative influence on you, whether they are, artists in whatever way they are, it's so important. And bringing your kids to galleries or museums or letting them go to that school that has that one art class, even if they don't pursue
Mm-hmm.
this professionally, I think just opens up the mind in so many other ways. And, we have to think outside the box sometimes. As
Mm-hmm.
humans, it's only how we advance. And so, with respect to thinking outside the box, something that's unique to your work also is your play of scale. So, sometimes animals can be a bit larger than usual, as you can see
Mm-hmm.
here. Sometimes maybe they're more realistic to scale. But then in other cases, obviously, they grow to be quite gigantic. The gargantuan deer, for instance, over here too. This kind
Mm-hmm.
of plays more of a realistic twist. So I'd be curious to know what paranormal or what elements of science fiction or surrealism itself has inspired you to get to this point where now you want to kind of have these overgrown animals playing with these beautiful elements of architecture.
Yeah, so something I'm also quite inspired by in literature, and again aspects of Andrew Wyeth's work, is kind of this magical realism. Um, in an age where kind of science is very dominant and we like to think that we know facts about everything, and we know definitely what the surface of the moon is like, and we know why birds behave certain ways. We like to think that we're in control of every aspect of the life we're surrounded by. But something that Wyeth's work um, really brings back to me, and authors as well, is that there are certain things that surround us that we still don't quite understand. And I think it's humbling to accept that we don't understand everything and that we can't possibly understand everything, that there are strange things that happen around us and forces that behave in ways that we don't really fully grasp or should ever grasp. Um, and a lot of the animals within within my pieces are just kind of metaphor and allegory, to different aspects. You know, whether you see it as literally just being, nature, overarching architecture. So nature overarching man-made things is kind of a reference to the sublime era, or just kind of references to the passage of time. There's the one piece that's similar to this one, the snow-covered barn. Um, that wolf I kind of saw as a changer of seasons. This spirit that would, take the leaves off the trees and lay the snow down on the ground, um, in a way that was very popular also in Japanese culture. The changers of the seasons would be these spirits that could sometimes be seen in animal forms. Um, so I just think I just like to imagine all of these different forces that are beyond us, surrounding us every day, just as kind of these animal creatures that maybe we can't see, or animals that we pass by and don't think twice about, even though they're, maybe these things in disguise.
I think also, as you mentioned earlier, the idea of parallel universes existing,
Mm-hmm.
planes that we can't see, perceive, feel, or understand, but that perhaps do exist, as some theories suggest. And so, again, reminding us as humans that we don't know everything, and we
Mm-hmm.
probably can't possibly know everything. And so, kind of enjoying the simplicity of things, but also relishing in the complicated, which, of course, as humans, we're exposed to and we have in ourselves quite a bit. And I think your work truly does focus on those dualities too, because some scenes, such as here, are so busy and overrun with detail and line work and action, and then you have something that's so quiet and a bit more minimal and peaceful. But the piece over
Mm-hmm.
here that we were just speaking about too, and again, that reminder that there are two sides to everything, and that level of balance is extremely important to maintain.
Yeah, and it's again a marker of those passages of seasons. You know, the piece to the right of this, Evening Storms, is reference to, sometimes towards the tail end of summer, early September, a lot of the East Coast faces hurricanes and these really powerful storms that kind of show us how small we are when they can kind of wipe out houses and cause these huge mudslides. And then to the left of that, we have winter, where just everything is kind of, you know, the birds fly south and there's no rustling of the leaves because everything's just kind of covered in this thick blanket of snow. And you step outside and you just hear this absolute stillness and nothing's moving and there's no sign of life. And just a few months later, there's leaves on the trees and there's wind and animals running around. And it's just kind of important to remember that there are these significant periods. That's something I really missed when I did live in Georgia. Is it's pretty much warm there year round. It's hard to know, the difference between fall and summer, and that's something I really grew to appreciate and kind of expect in life growing up in New England. Is there's just these really clear markers between seasons, and you can kind of compartmentalize certain memories because you just remember like, okay, this happened while there was snow on the ground, or this memory happened while the leaves were these glowing red colors, and I kind of lost that feature, I guess, when I lived somewhere that didn't have seasons. So it was kind of coming back from that setting and experiencing seasons again for the first time, and that's again where all those references to dandelion wine come in. Him, Ray Bradbury, reminiscing on all these, he, remembering him in his childhood, seeing these experiences for the first time, and seeing the world through these new eyes. And I was kind of experiencing the seasons again, and the passage of time, and these small indicators that time was passing, just through these small details of nature and weather and animals present and so forth.
Again, yeah, just the theme of time and how things are cyclical, but things die and then they're reborn and life continues always. And I think it's just a tenet that, again, as humans, we have to be reminded of and always remember things are a part of life and they don't always work in the way that we want them to or that we'd like them to, but it's just the nature of it and it's beyond our control.
Absolutely.
So we're going to be at the hour mark in a couple minutes. So I know we went on here with you guys already, so you've had questions that were really great in the past, but if you'd like any of those revisited or if there are new ones, just chime in at any point. But just again, as a reminder, this is a collection of work from Calvin, and it's his show that's up for the next month. Hopefully, we can open up by appointment only or something of the like before the month's over, so you guys can see them in person if you're local. As we touched upon earlier, they're really incredible because they have that push and pull effect. So you have the ink laid down on the playboard, and then you have it pulled off. You have remnants of his process, as you guys can see with the blue that we mentioned earlier, and you have a grand sense of story, a beautiful development of architecture. And I just think you'll fall in love if you see them in person. So if it is possible for us to do so, just be in touch and we'll of course announce if we can open up and have the works on exhibit and of course frame them for such. And so half of these have sold. So if you guys have questions about any of the remaining ones, you're always welcome to DM me or email us and we can send you more pictures, videos, which of course we'll do for social media for the next month. Talk to you guys about payment plans. We're still shipping. Everything is normal except for the fact that we don't get to share the work with everyone in person. And that's probably the hardest and saddest part of what it is we're doing. But as mentioned in past videos too, should things open up in 2 months from now, what work remains will be hung in the gallery. So you guys can still have a taste of what the work's like in person. And so I thank you guys all for tuning in. Calvin, is there anything you want to mention about this series or about your work that we didn't talk about yet?
Yeah, I mean, I just really hope that we can sometime soon get together again and,
Yes.
you know, look at these works in person because, we experience so much of our art through our phone screen, even though that's maybe one of the least perfect ways to view art just because it's on such a small format and the resolution does no justice to anything here, especially with the works of the um, other shows happening on at this time. Um, it's just really important to support artists and buy prints and experience these pieces in person and interact with them, especially when we're just so limited every other way.
Absolutely. I mean, we're so fortunate that we have the technology that we do to do such things. Because if you think
Mm.
100